Good morning. How is everyone this fine morning? Good, I hope. Glad to be here with you. We are continuing on in our series. It's Call to Action, and we're in James chapter 5 this morning. So what is the longest you have ever had to wait? Do you put a time limit on how long you are prepared to wait? At what point do you say, you know, that's just enough of that, and I think I'm going to move on? You know, perhaps your patience was tested even this morning. You went to get coffee from the coffee shop, and usually there isn't a queue there, but you got there and there's a queue, and you went, oh, I have to wait. Or maybe the barista was kind of slow this morning, maybe, you know, had a heavy Saturday night and not usually up to their usual zip, and you've had to wait. And you go, oh. You know, it's a funny thing, like Starbucks. When Starbucks first started out, it was all about the experience, right? And people would go, and like this was a new experience, you know, individually having your coffee made, and people were prepared to wait for that. But after a while, and Starbucks became more popular, and the queues began to grow, right, that's when the grumbling started. And so Starbucks Corporation started encouraging their baristas, like, okay, you need to get on with this, right? Be snappy. Let's get some efficiency going here. Let's make get it streamlined. And so they started churning out coffee a lot faster. And that was good because the queues shrunk. But then what? Well, people started complaining. Well, it's not the experience, right? So it's like typical, isn't it? We want the experience, don't we? But we don't actually want to have to wait for the experience. And the same is kind of true with patience, isn't it? We want to be patient, but we don't actually want to wait to learn how to be patient. But the problem is, of course, that patience comes through learning how to be patient. Because I think the problem is that we don't really know what patience is. We might know what good coffee is, but do we really have any idea what patience is like? Or you go, well, Bryan, mate, I am patient. I wait, for a second for my web page to load. Sometimes if it's really want to see it, I'll even wait an extra half a second for it to load, right? I waited 5 minutes for someone to text me back the other day. And half an hour for someone to respond to my email. Because the problem is our culture is not really about patience, is it? In fact, it's the opposite. We might extol the virtue of patience, but we seldom put that into practice. Because in our culture, in our world, patience is not required. That we should not have to wait for anything, really. Not for coffee, not for anything else. If you're hungry, you get on your app, right? DoorDash, straight there. Want some music? Stream it. Get on Spotify. If you want something from Amazon, couple of clicks, right? And you expect it to be on your doorstep next day. In fact, I ordered a book the other day and it's still not here. We're like, what is the problem with that? You don't even have to patiently save money to get all that stuff, because you just whip out a credit card and bang, it's on the cart. The world in which we live today is not conducive to making us patient. Now, maybe some people inherit patience, right? Because some people are just naturally more patient than other people. Like my old man, he was a pretty patient person, and he would make models and stuff, like plastic models and other models, and he tried to get me into that kind of thing, right? And I kind of wanted to do that, but I just wasn't very good at waiting for the glue to dry properly. And the paint to dry properly, and the paint would kind of run into each other, and there would be fingerprints all over it, And I just didn't really inherit his patience. So this morning, what are we going to do? Because James's call to action for us this morning is to be patient. We're going to ignore it and say, well, James, mate, that's fine for your day, but, we live in the 21st century. We can't afford to be patient, which is kind of a condescending attitude, isn't it, really? And we might think, well, patience gets you nowhere today. And yet, perhaps we have it the wrong way round, that patience is everything. Let's read James chapter 5, verse 7 through 11. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you might not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. We'll stop there, actually. Be patient. That is James's conclusion. He says, therefore, right, be patient. Well, why should the people that he's talking to be patient? Well, in the preceding verse that we talked about last time, it was because of the rich, right? And the rich farmers were like hoarding everything and keeping all the grain and the resources. They were even holding back the wages of the laborers, which was a real problem because back in those days there was no savings, right? People lived from day to day. They were paid every day, and if you didn't get paid for your day's work, then you were in trouble. You're not going to eat that night. And so there was a big problem, and it would be really easy for people to lose patience with the whole situation. But James's call to action is be patient. And why should they be patient? Because James says Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. And when Jesus comes back, he will sort it. And the rich will get their comeuppance, and it'll all be just fine. Life might be really tough right now, but hang in there because Jesus is going to come back and he is going to sort it. So be patient. It's easier to be patient, isn't it, if you have the assurance that something is going to happen. It's not so easy to be patient if you think, well, it might happen or it might not. Because if you think that way, then you're likely to take things into your own hands, aren't you, right? I may have told this story before, but never mind. Many Christmases ago when I was a kid, I really wanted this book. And I put it on my Christmas wish list, but I wasn't really sure I was going to get this book. And so one afternoon, right before Christmas, my mum took me into town. We were shopping, and I went into this second-hand bookshop, and lo and behold, there was the book. It's called The Scarlet Pimpernel, and it was an old book, and it was kind of tatty, and the pages were yellowing, but nonetheless, that was the book that I wanted. And of course, being second-hand, it was cheap, so I bought it. And I went back to the car and said, Mum, look what I got. I found the book, right? And I could tell from her reaction she was none too impressed. Anyway, we got home and there was a little frosty silence on the drive home. And a little bit later she said, hey, Bryan, I want to show you something. And she pulled out of her bag a brand new copy of The Scarlet Pimpernel. And she said, see, that's what I was buying when you were buying that. But you're not going to get this now because you jumped the gun. And I did not get the book. She was true to her word. And I still have the tatty old copy of my Scarlet Pimpernel sitting in my bookshelf at home. And it reminds me and teaches me a lesson about patience. And it reminds me of the lesson that she taught me. Because if only I had kept in view, right, in vision, pictured what a brand new copy of that book looked like compared to the tatty old thing I was going to buy, right? I would never have bought that tatty old copy if I could kept in view that perfect one that she was going to get me. You know, we all have desires, and I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, that desires are not necessarily bad, right? God gives us desires, but the question is, where do we fulfill those desires? And are we patient to wait to fulfill those desires in the places that God says that we should fill those desires? C.S. Lewis, you know, one of my favorite quotes of his, says that it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Impatience, I would suggest to you, means that we are far too easily pleased. And the only reason we do that is because we haven't stopped to look at the incredible full picture of what God is offering us. I think a key word for patience that goes along with patience is hope. What are you hoping for? Because a sure sign that our hope has run out is when our patience runs out too. Hope and patience are linked together. A sure sign in our culture that there isn't much hope around in our culture is because there isn't much patience around in our culture. Because you're only prepared to wait for something that you really hope for, right? Apparently outside in the world, people don't have that much to wait for. Patience really is not practiced, or rather we don't have patience because we don't practice patience. Heather Hughes, she says this, that patience for us has been pushed to the extreme edges of human experience. We confront it only when forced, when unable to avoid the fact that we do not determine every aspect of our lives. Pregnancy, tragedy, illness, injury, and death. Attempting to have patience at these times can feel intolerable, like torture, because we have not practiced under day-to-day circumstances. We are thrown in at the deep end, completely untrained. So it's really not surprising, is it, that when circumstances come along in life that people really don't know what to do because they are just untrained in any aspect of being patient and having to wait patiently through something. I was chatting with my wife the other day, and she made the point that maybe post-COVID, maybe we have learnt some patience because, you know, with supply chain issues, you know, we've had to wait for things like 3 days for Amazon to deliver something to my doorstep. Or, you know, there's labor shortages. You know, we went to a restaurant the other day and, you know, the waiter told us, well, it's going to be like an hour before we can get food to you because we're so short-staffed. And it's be quite all right if you want to leave. He actually expected us to leave. And we said, no, it's all right, we'll stay. We've got nothing better to do. Although, if I'd had plans, then I wouldn't have been so patient. Which tells me that patience is not really found inside of me. Patience is found somewhere else. But where? Well, if only we could find out. And we can, because James has 3 places that we can find patience. And the first is that patience is intrinsic. James, he uses agrarian illustrations because obviously that was the society in which he lived in, and he continues with that. That a farmer sows her seed, right? And she has to wait for the early rains to bring germination and that first flush of growth. And then she has to wait again for the second rain, right? Which brings more growth and fattens the grain, ripens the fruit. There's nothing that the farmer can do to make the rain come. Just has to wait. And that requires patience. Because we're no longer really an agrarian society, are we? Most of us here in downtown Portland. When's the last time we've seen anything to do with agriculture? We go to the supermarket and we expect whatever fruit or veg we want to be there on the shelf, right? It can be in the middle of January, February, and I want strawberries, and lo and behold, there's strawberries on the shelf. Now, I have to say, when I was a kid growing up, that was not the case. You went to the supermarket in February, you did not expect to see strawberries there. You would have to wait until June. And then they were only around for a short period of time. If you wanted salad in the winter, that was unheard of. You weren't going to find lettuce and tomatoes in the winter, which I'm fortunate because I eat a lot of salad, so I'm very happy we don't have to rely on that. But we're kind of removed from the agricultural cycle now. But there's something intrinsic about that, though, that God built that into creation. That God built patience into creation. And it goes on all around us, whether we're in that rhythm or not. That God intrinsically put patience into his creation. A fortnight ago, a group of us, we went to the beach to kind of plan about Garden Church and dream about the vision of Garden Church. And of course, we walked on the beach, and that was great. But you know, there's a couple of things. One thing you notice when you're at the coast is there's this thing called the tide, right? And it goes in and it comes out twice a day. And you might want to go to a bit of a beach that's further down, right? But you can't get there sometimes. You will have to wait until the tide goes out again. Because God built that into his creation. It is intrinsic into his creation. We're enjoying the summer right now, and it's great. Or it was until this morning. No, it's still great. This is the first time we've seen rain since I don't even remember when the last time was. But come January or February, I know it's hard to believe for all you guys from Texas here, but it's not like this. And we will be longing for a day like even today. And we will have to be patient to wait for the cycle to come round. God has built that intrinsically into his creation. The question is, though, how intrinsic is patience in our lives? A couple of Sundays ago, I walked down the riverfront to church every time. And you have to cross the railway line, you walk along the riverfront. And I was walking along the riverfront, I could hear this train coming from behind me. I was like, oh no. Because come up here by the steel bridge, you've got to get across the railway line again. And I knew I wasn't going to beat it, so I just kind of resigned myself. Fortunately, I had lots of time, so I just hung out by these condos under the shade and prayed and waited for the train to pass. But it was one of these really, really long trains, and 15 minutes went past. I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And how much longer is it going to take? And then the train started to slow. And in my mind, I was like, wow, that's pretty slow. I could maybe do like the James Bond thing and crawl under one of the cars in time. And I was actually seriously considering that, by the way. And then I looked towards, and I could see the end of the train like 100 yards up the railway line. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll just walk up the railway line, round the end of the train, and back down the other side. And I have to say, I was not the only one that was thinking this, by the way, because there was 2 or 3 of us started walking up the railway line. We walked round the end of the train, started walking back down the other side of the train. But the thing is, right, the train was actually moving at walking speed. So by the time we walked back down, following the end of the train, and we got to the crossing, it was exactly the same time as if I just waited at the crossing in the first place. I don't know about you, but I do that with God too. I think, I can just walk around this, God. I don't have to wait for you. I can do this in my own time. And every time I try that, it always works out just the same as if I just waited in the first place. Maybe even longer sometimes. You know, we're so much about productivity and efficiency and on and on and on and drive. And I get it, you know, I just confess myself, right? I am that person. And yet, I want to become more like God himself. And God is patient. God set creation going. You know, we read in the Bible, it took him 6 days to create the world, right? The heavens and the earth. I guess he could have done it in 1 day, right? But he didn't, did he? He let each stage dry before he moved on to the next. And then he only made 2 people and told them to be fruitful and multiply this whole wide world. And God was patient because he set that intrinsically into his creation. And if we're going to be fruitful and multiply, that's going to require some patience. But those seasons are the long ones, aren't they? We want that fruitful season, but we don't want that season that comes before that prepares us to be fruitful. Jesus told his disciples that he was the vine and they were the branches. And he said that you have to be attached to me because without me you can do a few things. No, he said you can do nothing. Zero, zilch, nothing. And then he talked about pruning, right? That like a tree or a bush, that you have to prune out some of those branches. So instead of the energy going all over the place, right, it's just directed to a few branches. So those few branches then can produce better fruit. And that pruning season is essential. And you know, if you look at the cycle, agriculturally speaking, the winter, the fruitful season is really pretty short. Everything else is quite long leading up to that one bit. But that's what God built into his creation. And God, you know, he brings those seasons into our lives too, doesn't he? Where I'm going to bring a season into your life where you're just going to have to be patient. And you're just going to have to wait. And those circumstances, we don't like them, but they're intrinsic to what God is doing in us. And they help us learn to be patient. But we can be proactive too, you know. We can teach ourselves a little bit about how to be patient. Maybe we could take up something, I don't know about model making, but you know, I like to fly fish, and that actually forces me to be patient at times. And we can do it spiritually as well. We can practice spiritual disciplines. We can go away and fast and have times of solitude and pray and times of simplicity and just listen. And Jesus himself built those into his life. Sometimes patience is passive, sometimes patience is active. But we need it intrinsically in our lives. Jesus told a story about seed that landed on 4 different soils, and only one soil was fruitful in the end. And he said about that soil, he said, as for that in the good soil, they are those who, hearing the word, hold it fast in an honest and good heart and bear fruit with patience. So James's call to action this morning is that patience needs to be intrinsic in our lives if we want to be fruitful. Secondly, James says that patience needs to be loving. Do not grumble against one another, James warns. Judgment will come against the one who grumbles against another. A few weeks ago in James, we talked about the tongue, chapter 3 of James, and James's scathing critique of the tongue, and it's kind of uncomfortable, right? Because his conclusion is that the tongue is uncontrollable. And I would suggest to you that the tongue is even more uncontrollable when things aren't going our way. In those circumstances when patience is required, our tongue is often the least patient thing about us, right? We just unleash it on someone who is holding us up or is in our way or keeping us from what we want. Driving last week, we came upon a car in front of us, and he had a sticker in the back, and it said, "Old and in the way." And he wasn't wrong on both counts. But it made me think of this sermon as I was like, actually I wasn't driving, Leslie was driving, which was fortunate. You know, the closer the relationship you have, guess what more you will need? Patience, right? You know, I think of marriage, the closest relationship that a man and woman can have, what God created, doing life together. And when you get married, and we just celebrated our anniversary yesterday, that you quickly find out just how much patience you need. Because you start finding out about each other, right? And if you were to ask Leslie, unfortunately she's not here this morning because our granddaughter's sick, but she would tell you that she needed a lot of patience with me, and she still does need a lot of patience with me. You know, I read that quote from Heather Hughes just a little bit ago about people being unprepared for big circumstances in life, and I think people are unprepared for marriage these days because it requires what? Patience. Patience to do life together intimately. You know, when a wedding ceremony is performed, of course, you know, that 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is trotted out. And of course, it's a wonderful, wonderful passage about love. But what kind of love? Because not the emotional kind of love, is it? But what Paul says is that love is patient. And love is kind, that it does not insist on its own way. That there is no grumbling in love. That love and patience are inextricably linked together. It doesn't mean that you love everything. It doesn't mean that some things don't have to be addressed, right? But not in a grumbling, nasty, impatient kind of way. And you say, well, Bryan, mate, why should I be patient with somebody else? Because God has been patient with you. Because God loves us. And because he loves us, it necessitates that God is patient with us. That God's patience is forbearance, right? His forbearance of his judgment towards us. If that wasn't the case, I wouldn't be here this morning. In fact, none of us would be here this morning. Because if we look at the history of the world from the beginning of Genesis chapter 1 to today, think about how patient God has been over the last, whatever it's 6,000 so years. And God is patient even with little things that we think are inconsequential, that don't even matter to God. I think of Jesus when he first came to earth. And how patient he was when he started off his ministry. And his first miracle was with what? With a man, an unfortunate groom, who had miscalculated the amount of wine that he needed for his wedding. And Jesus could have said, deal with that, mate. You're on your own. That's your problem. But that's not what Jesus did, is it? He turned all this water into wine and didn't make just bad wine. He made the best wine ever. I know that's hard for us as Baptists to accept, but that's what he did. And he was patient with his disciples. He had these, they acted like Muppets half the time. For 3 years he put up with them, right? As they trailed around after him, misunderstanding him, not getting what he was talking about. And the crowds who just wanted more miracles, more bread. And Jesus' patience was tested to the extreme. He came down from the transfiguration and they were all arguing about how they couldn't, cast demons out of this one father's son. He was patient with those who doubted. He was patient with a woman who, in the middle of the crowd, touched the hem of his garment. He was even patient with a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. He was even patient with those who hated him. So if Jesus was so impatient, then it is incumbent on us to be patient with those around us as well. We can't say that we love people and be impatient with them. The two do not go together. That is an incompatible thing. Again, it doesn't mean that we have to accept everything and things don't need to be addressed. But our tendency is just to judge people in our impatience, isn't it? Jesus asked why we see the speck in other people's eyes, but we miss the plank in our own eye. And the reason is because we're impatient, right? Of course, we're perfectly patient with ourselves, but we're impatient with those around us because we don't love others like we love ourselves. To impatiently judge those around us means we don't really love them. But God's loving patience is for a reason, isn't it? And our loving patience is for the same reason, or should be for the same reason. And that's because we have a bigger picture in view. Often our impatience comes along with others because we lose focus of that big picture of what God is trying to do in someone's life. And we don't take God's patience for granted, though, do we? Because God is being patient to bring people into his kingdom. That is the reason for God's patience. Paul, writing to the Romans, says, "Do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance?" So James's call to action is loving others requires patience. And then lastly, it requires perseverance. Because James says that patience is not easy. It involves suffering, it involves hardship, trials, and then he gives examples of the prophets and Job. That patience requires perseverance through difficult times. I think I've already confessed that it's hard to be patient. I find it hard to be patient. I just want to get on, right? Again, we were at the beach, and I don't tell you this story to elicit sympathy, but we were walking on the sand, and it was a beautiful day, and the sand was warm, and it felt so good on my feet, and then I took a step and felt this twinge in my back, and I went, oh no, I know what that is. And sure enough, by the end of the day, I was almost crawling around on all fours, and by the next day, I really was crawling around on all fours just about. And it's not new for me, because I've struggled with back problems half my life. But I felt like 2 years ago I had surgery, and since then it's been pretty good, and felt like that had gone, but it's all back again now. And I just want it to go away, because so much of my life is built around doing physical activities, running and fishing and hiking and all that kind of stuff, and right now it's like I'm stuck. And I'm struggling, I admit it, with being patient. Because it starts to feel a little better, and you know what I want to do? It's like, I could go and run today. Or do this, or do that. But I know that I just have to wait and persevere. And I hope that it's not too long, and I hope that maybe it can be fixed again. But sometimes things can't be fixed, can they? And, I've been through a number of storms in my life, and some of them have been physical pain, and some of them have been emotional, mental pain, and other things. And sometimes things don't get fixed, do they? And sometimes we just have to keep enduring, and pain tests our patience. I was reading this book last week by Alan Noble. It's called On Getting Out of Bed. And he really asked the question, why do we bother getting out of bed in the morning? It's kind of a good question, I think. Now, when life is going well, right, it's easy to hop out of bed and go, I've got things to look forward to this morning. But he was actually writing this book from the perspective of suffering from deep, 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 dark depression. Debilitating depression. And maybe some of you have been there with that kind of depression. And when you wake up in the morning, that is a question. Why bother getting out of bed this morning? Because it could take all the effort that you can possibly muster just to bring yourself to pull back the bed sheets and get out of bed. And if the only reason for getting out of bed lies within yourself, then you're probably not going to get out of bed, are you? It has to be something bigger than that, something worth being patient through all that pain for. Again, Heather Hughes writes that patience is only possible for one who hopes, because without some form of hope, opportunities for patience can only be met with despair. I always find it fascinating, that James uses Job as his illustration of patience. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I read through the book of Job, patience is not the first thing that springs to mind with Job, right? And I'm not having a go of Job. I know he starts off well, right? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, and it all sounds so wonderfully spiritual and pious, doesn't it? And I was listening, it was a podcast the other day, and a guy was having a go at Mrs. Job, for her reaction, and saying that, well, she's going to be in hell. It's like, mate, you don't have the right to say that. Because she suffered horrendous loss too. All her children and everything. And you don't know what happened to her. The story doesn't say anything about her. Was Job that patient? Because he said some stuff, didn't he? Yeah. Ooh, Job, mate. And yet he was patient. Because he held on to his integrity, didn't he? And he persevered through the midst of all that pain and all that suffering, because he put his hope in what? Talking to God. He kept going back to God. He kept going back to God. He kept getting out of bed, not in the hope of getting his life back. That wasn't his hope, right? His hope was getting an answer from God. And yes, the end of the book, Job does get his life back, except he doesn't really, because he doesn't get those kids back. And we don't know if he got his wife. We don't know. But it doesn't mean also that our story is going to end the same way either. At least not getting our stuff back. I don't know what prophet James had in mind when he wrote this chapter. I kind of think maybe he had Jeremiah in mind. You think about Jeremiah, who ministered for 40 years, and all he got was dog's abuse, didn't he? He got berated and threatened and put down a well. He was imprisoned. He was abducted. Was his life productive? Not by our standards. Was it fruitful? Not by our standards, right? Because it seemed like he had no impression whatsoever on those that he talked to. And yet he persevered. He kept on going. Although he had nothing to show for it, he was faithful, which is God's measurement, by the way. Whether we are faithful in the calling and the time and the place that God has put us. You know, Jeremiah could have done a Jonah, couldn't he? I've had enough of this. I'm off, sailing off somewhere else. And really, who could blame him? But that is not what he did. So why would he stay and persevere through all that? Joseph Piper, he wrote this. He says that patience is not the indiscriminate acceptance of any sort of evil. It is not the one who does not flee from evil who is patient, but rather the one who does not let himself thereby be drawn into disordered sadness. To be patient means not to allow the serenity and discernment of one's soul to be taken away. Patience, then, is not the tear-streaked mirror of a broken life, as one might almost think to judge from what is frequently shown and praised under this term, but rather is the radiant essence of final freedom from harm. Patience is, as Hildegard of Bingen says, the pillar that is weakened by nothing. I like that phrase, the pillar that is weakened by nothing. You know, Hebrews chapter 11, it lists so many people, doesn't it, who persevered through difficult times. Some of them are well known to us, and some of them in that chapter itself, it doesn't mention their names. And they had horrific things done to them, appalling circumstances that they had to persevere through, that they had to get out of bed each morning. And why would they do that? Because they had a greater hope, something so much bigger. And of course, our ultimate example is Jesus Christ himself. Every morning, when he was here on earth, he got up out of bed. He knew how it was going to end for him. And he persevered through it all. Through the abuse, through the opposition, through his betrayal, his arrest, the false accusations, his condemnation, his sentencing, his flogging, his humiliation, the unbelievable physical pain. At any point, Jesus could have stopped it. But he didn't. He persevered. And worst of all, through the spiritual pain and loneliness. And why would he do that? Why would Jesus get out of bed every morning knowing what was coming down the pipe for him? Why would he patiently persevere through all of that? Because he had the hope of something bigger. Because he wanted his kingdom filled with people like you and me. Because he knew that our impatience had cost us from being in his kingdom. And yet through Jesus patiently enduring the cross and the suffering that he went through, he paid the price to bring us into his kingdom. And he's given us new hope in his resurrection. Something that gives us hope, something that makes us want to get out of bed every morning. The hope that we have new life in Jesus Christ. And because of that, we can persevere. The author of Hebrews again says, "For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised." James's call to action is for patience that perseveres. So how's your patience this morning? How long are you willing to wait? Is your patience intrinsic in your life? Do you have it built into you? Is your patience loving? And is your patience persevering? Is it a pillar that is weakened